involved in scouting, so actually we did do some river cleanup work and so on with some organizations. We could do more. I did use them though, or use the center for field trips and so on for our students. And yeah, basically we use it as a good teaching lab, an outdoor lab that was close by that we could look at. So that's the extent that we've done it. But yeah, there's opportunities to do that. There's undergrad research opportunities and so on. I work with a lot of students on projects, and we have also our university arboretum and so on in the forest that goes with that. So I've done quite a bit of work out there too. But, yeah, that's about
How do
the
those
size of it.
research facilities help you?
They help in general. I think if we're involved in management and educating the public, we're also, being a land grant university, we have an extension mission, which is to help people, help landowners and so on in the state and the citizens in the state. So a big value that they have is educational value, so people understand, hey, this is an invasive tree. I never knew that. I thought it was beautiful and I wanted to plant more, you know, and that kind of thing. And having people understand what some of the damages might be, especially with some of our insect pests like emerald ash borers, and learning not to move firewood around that might be infested, you know, and so on with the different insects and that kind of thing. It's a big important issue. And also I think beyond just teaching people, just like when I was a kid, I went to nature centers all the time, and to me it caused me to you know, understand and value kind of the open areas that we have and the natural forests that we have. And the third thing is it's a piece of habitat or a piece of the environment that can be managed for native species and ecosystems and so on. And you know, there's a lot of neat efforts out there to help, you know, conserve the native species that are on those properties, you know, like iams and so on. And it makes a nice addition, green space to the city of Knoxville here too, definitely in this county. So the more of that there is, you know, the more we can sustain, the better. You know, so.
Absolutely. How do you think those green spaces and places like IAMS benefit the community?
Well,
just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, overall I think that there's a lot of recreation value in that for people's well-being and health, that kind of thing. So jogging trails, you know, the kind of the peace that people get just from being outside and listening to the birds and that kind of thing, seeing wildflowers come up in the spring, and you know, everybody loves springtime to see everything wake up and that kind of thing. And for me personally, it makes me more relaxed to spend time outside. So for so many people, I think that's a big value too. Besides the education, it's just plain enjoyment, you know, that's out there. And when you've got a lot of more areas with more pavement and concrete and so on, and you know, it's a lot more enjoyable place to be and that kind of thing. But as a community overall, again, there's that sort of ecosystem level benefit of all our native forests and so on, that, you know, it helps moderate the environment of the urban forest and that sort of thing. When I did work with Forest Service in the past, I worked in a wilderness area, and you could physically feel a difference. It was much cooler in that area. There were a lot of lakes there too, but it was not so wide open, you know, it was much warmer because there was less canopy cover, you know, all the surrounding farmland and so on. It was a big difference that you could perceive. And when you get an urban area like Knoxville, you know, the more green space, I think, the more it moderates some of that stuff and traps pollution. Trees will, you know, get some deposition on them, but it helps, you know, basically with rainfall and so on. They can help, you know, trap some of that stuff. But I hate to talk about trees like they're dust filters. You know, I don't know if that's 100%, you know, accurate either, really. But one thing that is true is tree roots and streams and so on do clean water, and the more stuff that's growing in a stream, the more sediments, the more rocks and gravel and sand and everything, it actually helps clean the water. But a big thing that trees do too is floods, like we just had lately. When you have more and more hardened surfaces, you see where all the puddles are. Those are usually compacted soils and so on. And with just a grass cover, there's not much to absorb the extra rainfall. So with trees, you get a nice deep layer of litter, and it will, you know, act as a sponge to help slow down that water. It doesn't run around so much, and the roots actually stop that too, the physical roots and trunks and the dead wood and the logs and so on. But the leaves help slow down that event so that they hang onto the water, then they give it to the soil slowly. So when you don't have that, it all ends up in the stream really quick, and you get get these rising streams and floods and so on. So in the West, especially with large mountains and the Rockies and so on, what you do with the forest, you can increase water supply. If you cut trees and cut forests, it helps, it really speeds up the amount of water that comes down the mountainside, and then when there's heavier forest cover, it slows it down. So you can see a pretty clear relationship there. So they have a lot of what you call ecosystem services too that they produce, provide and kind of, overall benefits that cost a lot of money otherwise, like flood control and so on. You can have trees doing it, or you can, engineer a bunch of barricades and seawall type structures and that kind of thing. So they have a lot of value, and there's still people working on what the actual value is, the ecosystem services that you get from forests. But if you can put a monetary value on it, you can also educate people and say, hey, would you rather have a few trees, or would you rather, pay this much to, mitigate this particular problem? So it comes from the forest overall. So they're just benefited by the forest.
What would be some of the effects on the local environment if invasive species are allowed to push out the native species?
Yeah, environmental, it could be things like, how much water evaporates from the surface of the earth. Actually, to be honest, if it's a tree or something that uses a lot of water, I believe it's salt cedar out west that actually will cause streams to dry up because they pump so much moisture, and that's an extreme case, in more arid regions. But you do get changes in basic functions like evaporation, evapotranspiration, the cycling of water changes a bit. I'd say basically you have a difference in species composition than you'd be expecting and so on. So, it's more a conservation of native species that probably have their optimum function when they're growing together. Since there are new species that come in, again, you can have the chance of them displacing the whole native community, so you may reduce diversity, so it's dominated by one species, and that may have another effect on, say, the wildlife in the area and so on. That may affect hunters and so on. We're not all directly tied to hunting out in the forest, for our food, but it can have impacts on composition at different trophic levels or different, how things function. But also, if we were to get things that change nutrient cycling, which happens with some species, break down faster than others, that can change how fertile an area might be and that sort of thing too. So there are definitely ecosystem consequences, and things like species that burn really easily and so on. That, as I say, that's almost an immediate risk. When you've got species that are very flammable, and you have people, they call it the wildland-urban interface, people that live close to the forest and so on. If it's something that is very flammable, like we saw with the Gatlinburg fire, those were native pines that burn really easily. But anytime that we all like to live out kind of where there's trees and so on, but when you get close to even native species that burn really well and frequently, there's a hazard there too. So some things too, invasive plants can bring invasive insects with them, and that can damage other species, maybe even crop species we rely on. It can also bring other non-native animals along, and things like non-native microbes. A lot of different things can come in unison kind of, so it could change things. Direct risk, it's hard to evaluate, but it depends on how aggressive a species is. Some of these things that are killing forests outright, what I worry about is we lose kind of one set of species over time, and it's increasing the number of things. Like first we had the chestnut blight that killed all the chestnuts except for the sprouts, and then we had Balsamolia delta that killed a lot of the Fraser firs at the top of Klingman's Dome in the mountains and so on. We've lost a lot of those. They still are there, but they're smaller. Usually will die. They won't get to be a large, tree. They'll reproduce and so on. And now we've got hemlock woolly adelgid that's killed all the hemlocks, and then emerald ash borer, and what's next and so on. So eventually, I'm not sure with one species that's dominating, I'm not sure what we're going to get in the future too. So it's tough to see things kind of disappear, and those are from transplanted species, that aren't native. So they can often spread unchecked again because they don't have natural predators and that sort of thing to help control the population. So, but sometimes, you know, you wonder what's going to happen worldwide, because a lot of things are moving around right now because of global trade and so on. It's hard to see, hard to expect, or hard to plan, hard to predict, you know, what kind of composition we're going to end up with in 100 years. You know, I think there will be things growing here, there will be functions and so on. So, some big changes. But to tell you, I don't know if you're going to use this or not, but it's hard to come up with an absolute risk to health and life and so on, other than changing the ecosystem. You know, it's hard to say. That's uncertain what the effects are going to be. You know, but I think places like Florida too, there's a lot of invasive species there, and like wetland-urban interface. If you have like pythons in the Everglades, you know, and so on, or in the area near subdivisions and that kind of thing, there's a direct risk there too, definitely, for pets at least, and that